the streets, we started to see a cultural shift. For example, NASCAR banned Confederate flags. There is at races, and Confederate statues began coming down across the country. This past Thursday, Louisville police banned no-knock warrants in the wake of Breonna Taylor's death. And just yesterday, the New York City Council backed a proposal to slash $1 billion from the NYPD budget. As these demonstrations enter a third week, the question now is how to sustain that momentum. With me now is Judith Browne Dianis. She's the Executive Director of the Advancement Project National Office. Kimberly Atkins is an MSNBC contributor and Senior Washington Correspondent for WBUR, Boston's NPR station. Brittany Cooper is an Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies and Africana Studies at Rutgers University, and her book, Eloquent Rage, a Black feminist discovers her superpower, has earned its well-deserved place on the New York Times bestsellers list. Thank you all so much for being with us. Judith, I want to start with you. That is a big list of accomplishments in a very short period of time. What do you anticipate seeing next?
Well, first, we need to make sure we understand that the work against systemic racism and police brutality and misconduct has not just started, right? This work has been going on for quite some time. That organizations across the country, like Advancement Project and others, have been doing this work. And so this moment has opened up an opportunity for us to talk about doing something radically different, that we can't continue to see Black people dying at the hands of the police. But not only that, it's the chokeholds, it's the no-knock warrants, it's also stop and frisk. And so I think moving forward, what we're going to see is that people are calling for defund because we want a refund. We want an investment in Black community. All of the structural problems that we saw with COVID that made Black people more susceptible to COVID-19, we want investments. And so that means taking money from the police budgets to be able to pay for healthcare, better schools and education, more hospital beds, all of the infrastructure, mental health, drugs, drug prevention, violence prevention. That's where the work is. And so we'll be pushing in Congress to make sure that they pass these reforms, but we know that's not enough. And locally, we'll be pushing to make sure that we get some of that money put back into Black communities.
Kimberly, to that point about legislation, you have congressional Democrats introducing the Justice in Policing Act that would bar chokeholds and federal no-knock warrants, limit the transfer of military-grade equipment to state and local law enforcement, mandate the use of dashboard cameras and body cameras for all federal law enforcement officers, and create a national police misconduct registry. Of note, the bill has no Republican co-sponsors. You don't have Republicans voicing support for it yet. What is it going to take to get a piece of legislation like this passed?
Well, it will take a bipartisan effort. It will take a buy-in from both parties in Washington to get something like this passed. Perhaps there might be a passage of some bill with that is less broad in scope. But keep in mind, all of these measures would apply only to federal law enforcement. The vast majority of policing in this country takes place on a local level. And so it would not impact that directly, except for a couple provisions like the one that bars the transfer of surplus military equipment to local police offices. That was a rule that was already in place, by the way. It was put in place during the Obama administration after Ferguson and reversed by the Trump administration. But what you are seeing are mayors and police chiefs listening to these protests. And you're seeing in cities from Boston to Los Angeles taking some measures, as you pointed out earlier. In Boston, the mayor announced yesterday that much of the overtime budget that had been in place for police overtime was going to be diverted. Some $9 million would be diverted into community programs because we know the evidence shows that in place where you have over-policing, in places where you have an increase of instances where people die at the hands of police, Black people die at the hands of police, there is a lack of education, there is a lack of affordable housing, there is a lack of other resources, or the police is being used, they're being put in schools, or they're being used as social service managers instead of law enforcement officers. So there's at least the beginnings of an effort in these cities to address that. We'll have to see where it goes. And the protesters and organizers I talked to say they want to keep the sustained pressure on these local officials until that happens.
Brittany, we recently learned of the deaths of two Black trans women, Dominique Remy-Fels and Rhea Milton. How do you build this movement? How do you guarantee that this movement is built to be truly intersectional as it moves forward?
It's a wonderful question. So what I want to say about that is that the movement for Black Lives prioritized making sure that we had trans folks in leadership. Really in 2015, a Black trans woman leader named Elle Hearns opened the first national convening for the movement for Black Lives in Cleveland 5 years ago, July 2015. And it was a signal that we would do this movement different than the civil rights movement had done, different than prior movements for racial justice, that we would have this commitment to a kind of gender justice. Part of the challenge here is that we are both having to deal with the outward manifestation of white supremacy. So this is fighting back against the state. This is the demand to defund police. And we're also having to do this internal work of decolonizing, right? Of undoing all of the problematic ideas that we have gotten as a consequence of white supremacy, of patriarchy, of capitalism, that make us think that there's only two genders when really gender is what you make it and how you define it. And so the movement for Black Lives has a whole lot of work to do, and they are really both trying to engage in community education of Black communities to help them to think more robustly about gender, because so much of the violence that happens to Black trans women, unfortunately, is perpetrated both by the state in terms of issues with unemployment, issues with healthcare, issues with housing insecurity, but it is also perpetrated in Black communities, often by cisgender Black men. And as a Black feminist, it becomes really complicated because we're both in the streets fighting for these very spectacular murders of Black men by the state, and also dealing with this problem of seeing the way that Black men are sometimes violent within Black communities, particularly to Black women, whether they are cisgender or transgender. But our clarion call is all Black lives matter, including Black trans lives.
Judith, I go back to the point you made at the top, which is this is bigger than police brutality. It becomes about policies, whether it's PPP or whether it's about access to health care. And then when you step away from policy, there's also the cultural shift that we're seeing happening in this moment, that these conversations are being had in newsrooms, in private schools, inside of corporations. How do you measure that progress?
It's hard to measure, but I will tell you that I've been doing this work for quite some time. And first of all, a few years ago, we weren't even saying the terms white supremacy. We're now saying that. The lexicon has changed. The fact that defund, the defund is where this movement started, like this movement, right? But people have been doing that work. And finally, that language is starting to take hold, so much so that people really are talking about abolition. And so this is a moment where we get to dream and we get to reimagine, and we are seeing in the media, the way that people are talking about it, and it opens up an opportunity for us to think about something different that protects Black lives in a very different way. And so it's exciting. We do work around police-free schools. We won several school districts this past week who have ended their contracts, and that's because young people were demanding to have police out of their schools. So we're winning. This movement is winning, but we can't end here. This is entrenched work that has to continue.
Judith, Kim, and Brittany, thank you all so much. Up next, doctors say the warning signs are there. Coronavirus cases are rising in some key states. I'll ask a doctor why that may be and what can be done about it. And because of the pandemic, two presidential candidates will host two very different conventions. We'll talk more about those plans ahead.
My gums are irritated. I don't have to worry about that. Do I?
Harmful bacteria lurk just below the gum line.
Crest Gum Detoxify, voted Product of the Year. It works below the gum line to neutralize harmful plaque bacteria and help reverse early gum damage. Gum Detoxify from Crest.
When you think of a bank, you think of people in a place. But when you have the Chase mobile app, your bank can be virtually any place. So when you get a check, you can deposit it from here. And you can see your transactions and check your balance from here. You can detect suspicious activity on your account from here. And you can pay your friends back from here. So when someone asks you, where's your bank? You can tell them, here's my bank.